The biggest mistake powerful people make is believing they own the source instead of the pipeline. The first sound that morning wasn't birdsong or the breeze drifting through the pines. It was the sharp metallic grind of an excavator claw biting into solid granite somewhere below my cabin. I stepped onto my porch with a mug of black coffee warming my hands, and the crisp mountain air carried the smell of fresh diesel exhaust mixed with damp earth that had rested untouched for generations. A line of yellow construction equipment crawled across the eastern slope like insects carving through the hillside, while workers in reflective vests hammered bright orange stakes into ground that had belonged to exactly 3 families since 1908. At the center of it all stood a polished white SUV with the familiar blue logo of Cedar Ridge Estates, HOA, printed across the door. Their president, Victoria Collins, pointed confidently toward the ridgeline with one hand while holding architectural drawings in the other, smiling the kind of smile that only comes from believing no one will ever tell you no. A brand new sign had already been planted beside the gravel access road leading toward my property. Private HOA Water Improvement Project. Authorized personnel only. I actually laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because I knew something every person standing there had somehow failed to learn before spending what looked like several $1,000,000. I didn't say a word. I simply watched as another drill bit disappeared into the mountainside, and somewhere beneath their expensive machinery, the underground spring that had quietly fed this valley for more than a century continued flowing exactly where it always had. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 46 years old, and before retirement I spent nearly 20 years designing watershed protection systems across the western United States. Most people hear the word hydrologist and imagine someone staring at streams with a clipboard. They never think about reservoirs, groundwater pressure, aquifers, or the invisible network beneath their feet that decides whether entire communities wake up to running water every morning. 3 months earlier, I had purchased this mountain from a mining company that considered it exhausted and worthless. They saw abandoned service roads, old survey markers, and acres of timber no one wanted to harvest anymore. I saw silence, clean air, and a place where I could finally spend my mornings fishing in the creek instead of sitting through engineering meetings. The cabin wasn't luxurious. Weathered cedar siding, a stone chimney, a wraparound porch, and enough distance from the nearest neighbor to hear the wind before you ever heard another engine. That peace lasted exactly 79 days. Cedar Ridge Estates had grown fast over the previous decade, filling the valley below with identical homes, perfect lawns, and rules about everything from mailbox colors to basketball hoops. They believed the mountain above them was simply unused land waiting for development. To them, it was empty space. To me, it was something entirely different. As Victoria raised her hand and gave another confident signal for the machines to continue climbing toward the ridge, I noticed one surveyor pause beside an old brass marker embedded in the rock, brush away decades of moss, glance down at the engraving for barely a second, then step over it without another thought. That tiny decision would eventually cost the HOA more than every house they had built beneath this mountain combined. I bought the mountain because I wanted fewer people in my life, not more. After 20 years of studying rivers, springs, floodplains, and groundwater systems across Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming, I had learned something that no engineering textbook ever bothered to explain. Water was never the real challenge. People were. Rivers followed gravity. Springs followed geology. Human beings followed money. That was usually where the problems began. My retirement had been simple by design. I sold my consulting firm, packed everything that actually mattered into a 3/4-ton pickup truck, and drove west until the highways turned into narrow county roads lined with towering ponderosa pines. When I first walked this property, the only sounds were the steady whisper of wind through the trees, the distant rush of water somewhere below the cliffs, and the rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker hidden high above me. The old mining company representative apologized for how isolated the place was. He warned me about rough access roads, aging survey markers, and abandoned equipment left behind decades earlier. I smiled through the entire tour because every complaint he listed sounded like another reason to buy it. The cabin itself had good bones. Thick timber beams, hand-laid stone, a wraparound porch overlooking nearly the entire valley. Every morning the sunrise painted the granite walls with shades of gold before drifting across the rooftops below. I spent my first several weeks replacing weathered fence posts, clearing fallen branches from old trails, repairing a small footbridge across the creek, and learning every inch of the land the same way my grandfather taught me when I was a boy. Walk it slowly. Listen before you touch anything. Nature always leaves clues for people patient enough to notice them. That habit paid off almost immediately. I discovered century-old property monuments hidden beneath moss, faded steel pins marking forgotten boundaries, and weathered brass caps embedded in solid rock that had survived countless winters. Every one of them matched the legal survey included with my purchase. The mountain had been documented with remarkable precision long before satellites ever existed. I kept copies of every deed, every survey, every environmental report neatly organized inside a weatherproof filing cabinet beside my desk. Years of engineering had made documentation feel as natural as breathing. My closest neighbor lived almost 2 miles away, an 80-year-old rancher named Walter Jennings. He stopped by one afternoon carrying homemade apple pie and enough local history to fill an encyclopedia. While we sat on the porch watching hawks circle above the valley, he pointed towards Cedar Ridge estates below us and quietly shook his head. He told me the subdivision had doubled in size over the last 5 years, and that the Homeowners Association had started acting like they owned everything they could see from their clubhouse windows. Hiking trails, creek crossings, utility easements, even sections of county land had somehow become community projects in their newsletters. Walter chuckled before taking another bite of pie and said, "They keep forgetting this mountain was here long before their entrance sign." At the time, I assumed he was exaggerating. I had spent my career solving technical problems, not neighborhood politics. I believed clear property lines and common sense would prevent unnecessary conflict. Looking back now, that might have been the only real mistake I made, because while I was carefully learning the mountain, someone else had already begun studying what the mountain could do for them. The first official visit came on a bright Thursday morning just after 9. I was repairing a split section of cedar railing when the sound of polished tires crunching across my gravel driveway interrupted the quiet rhythm of hammer strikes and birdsong. A white luxury sport utility vehicle rolled to a stop beside my workshop, its paint reflecting the mountain sun like polished glass. Victoria Collins stepped out wearing hiking boots that had clearly never touched real dirt and a pressed outdoor jacket that still carried the scent of expensive perfume instead of pine needles. She smiled before I even reached the driveway, the kind of practiced smile that belongs in real estate brochures more than genuine conversations. Behind her stood 2 members of the Cedar Ridge Estates board carrying rolled maps, tablets, and leather folders thick with paperwork. "Mr. Walker," she said warmly, extending a perfectly manicured hand, "we are thrilled to finally meet the new owner. Everyone has been talking about the beautiful mountain." I shook her hand politely and invited them onto the porch. "My father always believed you learned more about people by letting them speak than by interrupting them." Victoria admired the view for exactly 5 seconds before opening one of the maps across my outdoor table. The glossy rendering showed hiking trails, scenic overlooks, picnic shelters, observation decks, and something labeled Community Water Enhancement Corridor stretching directly across the eastern side of my property. She spoke with complete confidence, explaining how the neighborhood had outgrown its existing recreational space and how the mountain represented an incredible opportunity for everyone in the valley. According to her, the previous owners had always been supportive of community access, and she assumed I would continue that tradition. I quietly asked whether they had any recorded easements, licenses, or written agreements supporting those plans. She barely glanced up from the drawings before saying they had decades of community understanding and that legal paperwork often lagged behind practical cooperation. That sentence lingered in my mind long after she finished speaking. Engineers become suspicious whenever someone describes documentation as less important than assumptions. Before leaving, Victoria handed me a welcome packet filled with neighborhood newsletters, architectural guidelines, annual event calendars, and invitations to community meetings. Tucked inside was a colorful brochure describing Cedar Ridge Estates as a self-sustaining mountain community committed to environmental stewardship. I noticed several photographs featuring the stream that originated on my land. Not one caption mentioned private ownership. 2 weeks later, the brochures became construction crews. Survey flags appeared along my eastern ridge. Temporary fencing surrounded sections of forest I had walked only days earlier. Pickup trucks with engineering consultants parked beside county roads, while drones buzzed overhead mapping terrain without ever requesting permission to enter my property. I drove down to the temporary project office and calmly introduced myself to the site supervisor. He seemed genuinely surprised when I explained the land belonged to me. He pulled out his tablet, zoomed in on a digital planning map, and pointed toward a shaded corridor labeled Future Community Utility Expansion. Everything was approved through the Homeowners Association, he explained. We were told access had already been coordinated. There was no arrogance in his voice, only confusion. Someone farther up the chain had convinced an entire team that ownership questions had already been settled. As I drove back up the mountain that afternoon, I noticed fresh tire tracks crossing an old logging trail that led toward the highest spring on the property. The cool breeze carried the faint smell of freshly cut brush, and somewhere deep in the trees I heard the steady hum of portable pumps beginning their first round of testing. For the first time since buying the mountain, I stopped seeing isolated mistakes. I started seeing a carefully organized plan unfolding one confident step at a time. Over the next 3 weeks, the activity spread across the mountain with the confidence of people who had never expected anyone to question them. Every morning another truck climbed the access road before sunrise, its engine echoing between the cliffs, while backup alarms bounced through the valley. The clean scent of pine slowly gave way to the smell of freshly cut cedar and warm hydraulic fluid. Bright ribbons appeared around mature trees, temporary stakes divided sections of meadow, and stacks of blue plastic pipe began collecting beside the old mining road less than 300 feet from the upper spring. What surprised me was not the construction itself. It was how completely everyone believed they had the right to be there. One afternoon I followed a newly cleared path until I reached a crew installing a small monitoring station beside the creek. A young technician looked up, smiled politely, and thanked me for allowing the project to move forward. He genuinely believed I had already signed every required agreement. When I told him I had not approved anything, his expression shifted from friendly confidence to visible uncertainty. He checked his paperwork twice before quietly admitting every authorization had come through the Homeowners Association project office. That evening I decided to attend one of their monthly board meetings at the clubhouse below the mountain. The building looked more like a luxury lodge than a neighborhood meeting hall, complete with stone fireplaces, polished wood beams, and walls covered with framed photographs celebrating years of community growth. Victoria welcomed everyone with cheerful enthusiasm before unveiling a large presentation titled Sustainable Water Security Initiative. As slide after slide appeared on the screen, I noticed aerial photographs of my mountain, engineering sketches of collection systems, and digital renderings of new pipelines carrying spring water toward future neighborhood expansions. The audience applauded several times while Victoria spoke proudly about protecting the community for generations. Then she pointed directly at the image of the upper watershed and confidently announced that the spring had always served the valley and therefore belonged to the entire community in principle, regardless of outdated property boundaries. The room nodded in agreement. I raised my hand and calmly introduced myself. The applause disappeared almost instantly. I asked a simple question. Had anyone verified ownership before designing infrastructure on privately deeded land? Victoria answered without hesitation. She explained that community necessity often required practical solutions and that no reasonable landowner would deny access to something so important for everyone else. Several board members smiled as though the discussion had already been settled long before I entered the room. I thanked them for their time, gathered one of the printed project packets from the welcome table, and quietly left without another word. As I walked outside, the evening air felt cooler than usual, carrying the steady sound of sprinklers watering perfectly trimmed lawns throughout the subdivision. Back at the cabin, I spread the packet across my kitchen table beside my own property surveys. One detail immediately caught my attention. Their engineering drawings showed pipeline routes beginning several hundred feet below the actual origin of the spring. Whoever prepared the plans understood where the visible water emerged, but they completely ignored what existed farther uphill beneath layers of granite and fractured limestone. They were designing an expensive system around the symptom while overlooking the source. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the gentle rush of water flowing outside my open window, and realized the mountain had already revealed its first secret. The people trying hardest to control the valley did not truly understand the land they were standing on. I have always believed that the first response to a misunderstanding should be a conversation, not a courtroom. Early the next morning, I organized everything that mattered into a single weatherproof binder. Inside were certified copies of my deed, the recorded boundary survey, county parcel maps, mineral reservations, access records, and every environmental document that came with the purchase. Years of consulting had taught me that facts carried more weight when they were neat, organized, and impossible to misinterpret. The drive down to the Cedar Ridge Estates office took less than 15 minutes, but by the time I walked through the glass doors, I could already hear cheerful voices discussing landscaping contracts and summer events as though nothing unusual was happening on the mountain above them. Victoria greeted me with the same polished smile she had worn during our first meeting. I placed the binder gently on the conference table and opened it page by page. I showed her the surveyed boundaries, the recorded parcel identification numbers, the historical ownership chain, and the legal description matching every monument embedded across the ridge. I explained calmly that her contractors had crossed onto private property without authorization, and that I wanted to resolve everything before anyone invested more time or money into the project. She listened with folded hands, nodding politely, but her expression never changed. When I finished, she closed the binder, slid it back toward me, and said that paperwork often failed to reflect the realities of modern communities. According to her, the neighborhood had depended on that watershed for years, and practical use mattered more than technical ownership. I asked one final question. Had anyone obtained a recorded easement from any previous owner? She hesitated for only a second before replying that the board's attorneys were comfortable with their position. That answer told me far more than she intended. 2 days later, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. The return address belonged to a law firm representing the Homeowners Association. The letter was written in polished legal language, explaining that the planned improvements served an essential community purpose and encouraging me to cooperate in the interest of neighborhood welfare. It suggested that opposing the project could unnecessarily delay critical infrastructure benefiting hundreds of homeowners. I read every line twice while the steady sound of the creek drifted through my open kitchen window. There was one thing missing from the entire document. Not a single paragraph identified an easement, license, purchase agreement, or recorded property interest granting them the right to build on my land. They simply assumed necessity would eventually outweigh ownership. I did not respond with another letter. Instead, I spent the afternoon walking the upper ridge alone. The air smelled clean after a light rain, and tiny streams trickled between moss-covered stones exactly as they had long before any subdivision existed below. I stopped beside the old brass survey monument that one worker had casually stepped over weeks earlier. Kneeling beside it, I brushed away another layer of damp moss until the engraved numbers became perfectly visible again. The marker pointed toward a line that did not merely define property, connected to something much older. Nearby, hidden beneath loose granite and thick roots, I noticed a weathered steel box almost completely buried beneath decades of fallen needles. Its rusted latch resisted at first before finally giving way with a dry metallic snap. Inside rested several oilcloth-wrapped folders untouched by sunlight for generations. The faint scent of aged paper rose into the cool mountain air as I carefully unfolded the first brittle document. Within seconds, I realized I was no longer looking at ordinary property records. I was holding the beginning of a story that everyone in the valley had forgotten. The oldest document was dated May 14, 1912, typed on heavy linen paper with a county seal that had faded to little more than a pale circle. Beneath decades of dust and moisture, the ink remained remarkably clear. It described the original purchase of the mountain by the Carson Timber Company, but the real discovery was attached behind it. Folded into quarters was a hand-drawn geological survey prepared by the United States Geological Survey in cooperation with the State Water Commission nearly 20 years before the first highway reached this valley. Every contour line, every fracture zone, every underground collection chamber had been carefully mapped by engineers who understood the mountain far better than anyone living here today. I spread the map across my kitchen table beside my modern satellite surveys. Within minutes, I realized something extraordinary. The visible spring flowing down the eastern slope was only the overflow point. The true recharge basin stretched almost 3/4 of a mile farther uphill, entirely inside my property boundaries. Rain and snowmelt filtered through fractured granite into a massive underground aquifer before emerging where everyone assumed the water began. They had spent years staring at the faucet without ever asking where the pipe started. My pulse stayed calm, but my mind moved quickly. I opened another folder. This one contained correspondence between the original landowners and the state engineer's office from 1918. One sentence immediately caught my attention. The mountain watershed had been officially recognized as a protected headwater source with senior recorded water rights attached to the deed rather than any individual structure built below it. That distinction mattered enormously. Water use downstream could change over time, but ownership and management of the protected recharge area remained tied to the mountain itself, unless formally transferred through recorded legal instruments. I searched through every remaining page expecting to find some later amendment granting access or shared ownership. There was nothing. No easement. No conveyance. No perpetual community right. Nothing. Instead, I found inspection reports from the 1950s confirming periodic monitoring of the recharge basin because of its unusually stable year-round flow. I quietly smiled for the first time in weeks. Not because I wanted to defeat anyone, but because the mountain had finally answered the question I had been asking since the construction crews first arrived. They had built their entire expansion strategy on assumptions instead of records. Before doing anything else, I called an old colleague named Rebecca Lawson, now a consulting hydrogeologist with more than 30 years of field experience. After listening patiently, she asked me to send high-resolution photographs of every document and every survey marker I had found. Less than 24 hours later, she called back. Her voice carried the measured confidence of someone who had reviewed thousands of technical reports. She confirmed that the historical mapping aligned almost perfectly with modern geological data and suggested I commission a current groundwater recharge analysis before making any legal moves. That advice fit perfectly with my own instincts. Arguments create opinions. Scientific measurements create evidence. The following morning, I hired an independent environmental surveying firm with no connection to the county or the Homeowners Association. Their assignment was simple: document everything exactly as it existed before another shovel entered the ground. As I watched the survey team carefully unpack precision instruments near the upper ridge, the cool mountain breeze carried the familiar sound of water flowing unseen beneath layers of ancient stone. For everyone else in the valley, it was just another quiet stream. For me, it had become the missing piece that transformed an ordinary property dispute into something far larger than anyone below the mountain had imagined. I did not file a lawsuit. I did not call the sheriff. I did not even send another letter. Experience had taught me that the strongest legal victories are usually built long before anyone walks into a courtroom. While the Homeowners Association continued expanding its project, I quietly began building something far more valuable than an argument. I built a record. Every morning the survey crew climbed the mountain carrying laser levels, groundwater sensors, and sampling equipment packed into weatherproof cases. The crisp morning air smelled of wet stone after several days of light rain, and the only sounds above the construction zone were the steady clicks of measuring instruments and the distant rush of water beneath layers of granite. Every location was photographed. Every survey monument was documented with precise coordinates. Every temporary access road, trench, and equipment staging area was mapped before another tire touched the ground. Rebecca coordinated the hydrogeology report while an independent environmental engineering firm measured groundwater recharge rates throughout the upper basin. Their preliminary findings confirmed exactly what the century-old records had suggested. The visible spring represented only a small release point from a much larger underground system extending beneath nearly the entire upper ridge. Disturbing that recharge area without proper engineering review could permanently alter water movement throughout the watershed. That conclusion came from licensed specialists, not from me. I wanted every conclusion to stand on its own. Next came the county engineering office. Rather than accusing anyone of wrongdoing, I simply requested confirmation that all construction affecting the protected recharge basin had received the appropriate technical reviews. The staff members were professional and courteous. They searched permit databases, reviewed project files, and promised to verify several details. 2 days later, I received a polite telephone call asking if I could provide copies of the historical watershed documents I had recently discovered. That request alone told me they had not seen them before. I gladly shared certified copies along with the new geological survey. After that, events began moving without any encouragement from me. The State Water Resources Office requested additional mapping. The Environmental Quality Division scheduled a site inspection. Even the County Planning Department asked for updated boundary verification after comparing modern construction plans with historical property records. Meanwhile, construction below continued at full speed. New pipe sections arrived by flatbed truck almost every afternoon. Concrete foundations appeared beside the creek. Workers installed additional monitoring equipment while Victoria proudly posted photographs in the community newsletter celebrating rapid progress on the neighborhood's water security initiative. She thanked volunteers, contractors, and board members for their vision, while promising homeowners that the project would support future generations. Reading those articles over breakfast each morning almost felt surreal because I knew every new investment increased the consequences of one overlooked assumption. Walter stopped by one evening carrying fresh peaches from his orchard. We sat on the porch watching sunlight fade across the valley while distant construction lights flickered below like tiny stars. He asked why I seemed so calm despite everything happening on the mountain. I smiled and poured him another cup of coffee before answering honestly. Engineers learn that rushing toward a solution usually creates a larger problem. Gravity never hurries. Water never argues. It simply follows the path allowed by the land. The law often works the same way when every fact has been properly documented. As darkness settled over the ridge, I looked toward the quiet spring disappearing beneath ancient stone and realized I had not stopped the project at all. I had simply allowed every agency responsible for protecting the watershed to begin asking the same questions I had asked weeks earlier. This time, however, the answers would not depend on opinions. They would depend on records, measurements, and the mountain itself. The turning point arrived on an unusually quiet Tuesday morning. There were no backup alarms echoing through the trees. No delivery trucks climbing the access road. Even the constant hum of portable generators had disappeared. Instead, I heard something far less dramatic but far more important. The soft crunch of several government vehicles rolling slowly over the gravel below my cabin. By the time I reached the overlook with a pair of binoculars, representatives from the County Engineering Office, the State Water Resources Division, the Environmental Quality Department, and 2 licensed hydrogeologists were already walking the construction corridor together. Nobody was arguing. Nobody was raising their voice. They were simply comparing maps, checking survey markers, photographing excavation sites, and following the flow of water uphill one careful step at a time. Victoria arrived nearly an hour later, still carrying the same confident posture I had seen since the day we met. She greeted the inspectors with polished professionalism and immediately began explaining how the project would strengthen long-term water reliability for the community. One of the state engineers listened patiently before unfolding the century-old geological survey beside the modern construction plans. Even from a distance, I recognized the exact moment the conversation changed. Several inspectors looked uphill toward the recharge basin while another compared property boundaries against the historical watershed records. Within minutes, they left the visible spring entirely and continued climbing toward the protected headwaters. They spent nearly 3 hours documenting every feature above the construction zone. That afternoon, bright orange notices appeared at multiple work areas instructing contractors to suspend all activity pending regulatory review. The excavators shut down one by one until the entire mountainside became silent again. A week later, the formal findings were released. Independent reviews confirmed that portions of the project had entered a protected recharge basin without the required environmental analysis or verified legal access rights. Additional review determined that historical senior water rights attached to the mountain property had never been transferred or modified through any recorded legal instrument. The issue had never been whether the neighborhood needed water. The issue was whether anyone had the authority to alter the protected source without following the law. The answer was no. Several days afterward, I attended a county hearing where engineers, surveyors, hydrogeologists, and attorneys presented documents one after another. Nobody accused anyone of acting with bad intentions. The discussion centered entirely on records, technical evidence, and statutory requirements. When the final decision was announced, the county ordered all unauthorized infrastructure within the protected recharge area to be removed under approved environmental supervision. Restoration plans would be funded by the responsible parties, and any future access to the watershed would require negotiated legal agreements with the property owner before additional work could even be considered. As the meeting concluded, Victoria remained unusually quiet. The certainty that had once filled every conversation had disappeared beneath stacks of surveys, engineering reports, and historical records that no amount of confidence could change. During the following months, the mountain slowly returned to its natural rhythm. Temporary fencing disappeared. Construction equipment was hauled away. Disturbed soil was carefully restored with native vegetation under environmental supervision. Several members of the Homeowners Association board resigned, and new leadership publicly announced a commitment to rebuilding relationships with neighboring landowners instead of assuming cooperation. One crisp autumn afternoon, Victoria drove up to my cabin alone. This time she carried no presentation boards, no glossy renderings, and no legal letters. She simply asked whether we would be willing to discuss a properly documented water access agreement that respected both the law and the mountain. I invited her onto the porch, poured 2 cups of coffee, and opened a blank legal notebook instead of an old argument. Sometimes the strongest victory is not proving someone wrong. It is creating the first honest conversation that should have happened from the very beginning. By the following spring, the mountain felt like itself again. Wildflowers returned to the open meadows where heavy equipment had once been parked. Fresh pine seedlings pushed through carefully restored soil, and the clear stream outside my cabin carried the same steady melody that had greeted me on the morning I first unlocked the front door. Standing on the porch with a cup of coffee in my hands had become part of my daily routine again, except now the silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the silence that comes after everything unnecessary has finally settled. The agreement Victoria and the new Homeowners Association board eventually signed was surprisingly simple. Every access point was clearly documented. Every inspection requirement was written into the contract. Every environmental protection standard exceeded state regulations. The community received a legal, professionally engineered access arrangement that protected the watershed instead of threatening it. And every homeowner finally understood exactly where their water originated and why preserving the mountain mattered far more than expanding another subdivision. Rebecca joked that it might be the most thoroughly documented neighborhood water agreement in the entire state. She was probably right. Walter visited often during the summer, usually arriving with vegetables from his garden or another homemade pie. We would sit on the porch watching deer cross the valley while afternoon sunlight reflected off the rooftops below. One evening he smiled, pointed toward the subdivision, and quietly said, "Funny how people take better care of something once they know where it begins." I looked toward the distant homes, then back at the narrow stream disappearing beneath ancient granite before continuing its long journey downhill. His words stayed with me because they applied to far more than water. Several months later, the community invited me to speak at one of their annual meetings about watershed conservation. The same clubhouse where I had once listened to assumptions presented as facts now displayed historical maps, geological cross-sections, and educational exhibits explaining how mountain recharge systems actually worked. Children gathered around models showing rainfall filtering through fractured rock before feeding underground aquifers, asking questions with the kind of genuine curiosity adults sometimes forget to keep. Watching them reminded me why I had spent so many years studying rivers and springs in the first place. Knowledge protects things that ownership alone never can. Before leaving that evening, I walked outside just as the sun disappeared behind the ridge. The mountain cast a long shadow across the valley, exactly as it had done for more than a century. Nothing about its shape had changed. The granite still stood where it always had. The water still followed gravity without asking permission from anyone. The only thing that had truly changed was the people living below it. They no longer looked at the mountain as empty land waiting to be used. They understood it as the beginning of something they all depended upon. As for me, I never wanted to control anyone's future. I simply wanted the place I called home to be respected the same way it had quietly respected every generation before mine. Looking back now, I realize the mountain never needed me to defend it. It only needed someone willing to read the records, listen to the land, and allow patience to accomplish what anger never could. Justice is rarely the loudest sound in the valley. Most of the time it arrives as quietly as fresh water flowing through ancient stone. Steady, honest, and impossible to stop once it finds its proper course.